Imagine you're at work or school or maybe just at home and you have 10 things due by Friday. It's Thursday and you've gotten nothing done. You're struggling mentally and you know you'll be up all night and probably won't finish everything on time. Now, imagine struggling mentally in a monotonous, dehumanizing environment that only worsens your struggles and offers little to no psychological assistance. This is the reality for most mentally ill individuals in correctional facilities, specifically in the United States. In fact, most individuals end up in prison and fall to recidivism, which is the reoffending of a criminal due to their mental illnesses. However, many countries like Norway, Finland, and Germany have reformed prison systems that are readily equipped to get all inmates back into society. This suggests that correctional facilities are in dire need of psychological help for their inmates due to the negative impacts of incarceration on individuals, due to the facility's ill-equippedness, mass incarceration, and the drastic loss of access to healthcare within the community. Although you may not see yourself in the position of an inmate in prison, neither do most prisoners. One simple mistake could land you in a correctional facility that is dehumanizing and lacks the resources you need immensely. The U.S. criminal justice system is relying on prisons instead of fixing the mental health issue at hand, which in turn leads to the increase in mass incarceration of mentally ill individuals. In fact, according to Rhea Elfidel-Karabek, approximately 2 million people with serious mental illnesses are incarcerated annually. They are also usually imprisoned for non-violent minor offenses. However, according to Tom Barrett and Raymond Slaughter, they on average serve 47.3% of their sentences, while all other inmates serve an average of 28.1%. Furthermore, with these mentally ill inmates not receiving the treatment or attention they need while in prison, they often fall to recidivism. This creates a repeating cycle that increases mass incarceration, especially of individuals with mental illness. In addition to mass incarceration, correctional facilities are dehumanizing, which leads to a number of negative effects on inmates. An article from Jairé Smith-Pinnock describes his day-to-day life in prison. He begins the article by depicting the monotonous of his prison cell and then goes on to describe the appalling odors he smells each day. Overseasoned processed foods, diluted cleaning chemicals, misery, and faint odor of urine coming from the elders who can no longer control their bladders. Moreover, he expresses the psychological warfare he faces in prison due to the excessive amount of cameras watching his every move. Towards the end of this article, he explains how all of these factors make it harder for incarcerated individuals to re-enter society. This highlights the dehumanization and monotony of life in prison. Even then, in an animal study analyzed by David W. Oakes, it shows that solitary confinement with no stimulation can actually cause brain damage and self-destructive behavior even in animals. Just imagine what is happening to the individual's minds in solitary confinement within our criminal justice system if even animals are affected negatively. Not only is life in prison dehumanizing, prisoners often have to watch their peers die due to health complications, but also the death penalty. The death penalty is controversial. However, we cannot deny the fact that it is dehumanizing and doesn't just affect the prisoner receiving the death penalty, but it also psychologically affects other inmates within the prison. Furthermore, it normalizes violence, which can cause inmates to think it's okay to kill someone just because they're considered bad. The book Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson explores the dehumanization of the death penalty and all the negative effects it has on everyone, not just the prisoner receiving it. Some negative effects include a decrease in mental health, ultimately causing PTSD, depression, and even suicidal thoughts. Psychological help is needed more than ever in incarceration facilities due to the dehumanization of prisons, which contributes to the mental health crisis in institutions in America. However, these institutions are completely stripped of the mental health resources they need for these individuals. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, about 3 in 5 people with a history of mental illness do not receive mental health treatment while imprisoned. Dylan Ledford, a man imprisoned with a history of mental illness due to schizophrenia, is being held beyond a reasonable amount of time for his charges due to being pronounced incompetent to stand trial because of his mental illnesses. However, help isn't being provided to him. This is due to the incarceration facility's lack of mental health resources. Ledford's story, like many others, highlights the need for procurable resources for individuals with mental illness in prisons. In addition to the lack of resources, inmate wait times are unreasonable and have been ruled unconstitutional in some cases. Although the recommended amount of psychiatric beds per person is recommended to be 40 to 60 in the United States, we currently have 12 psychiatric beds per 100,000 people. This demonstrates the failure of the United States to acknowledge the mental health crisis and provide institutions with the resources they need in order to help these individuals. Moreover, Dana Miller-Irvin, a journalist who examines the U.S. healthcare system, reports at least 17 states have been sued over inmate bed wait times, and that a federal appeals court has ruled it's unconstitutional for inmates to wait more than 7 days after a court's finding of their incapacity to proceed. If inmates shouldn't wait more than 7 days for psychiatric beds, it doesn't make sense for the U.S. criminal justice system to only provide 12 psychiatric beds per 100,000 people. Furthermore, if this is the case, then almost every prisoner who is found incapable to proceed with their trial is being failed by the system, waiting an unconstitutional amount of time for a bed, and the incarceration facilities receive little to no penalty. Medication is also an underlying issue within prisons. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, more than 50% of individuals who were taking medication for their mental health conditions at admission did not continue to receive their medications once in prison. Nevertheless, other institutions are forcing their inmates to take medication, which can amount to brain damage and is therefore cruel and unusual punishment. The lack of resources, the ongoing health crisis, and the drug crisis within incarceration facilities represents the immense need for psychological assistance within these facilities. Moreover, when inmates with mental illness don't receive the psychological help they need in correctional facilities, this can result in many effects on the general public and the inmates themselves. In fact, when illnesses go untreated in these facilities, the recidivism rate rises to about 70%. That means 30% of individuals do not go back to some sort of correctional facility after serving time. This proves that the lack of psychological help in institutions leads to increasing crime rates in cities, endangering the public. Furthermore, the lack of funding, mass incarceration, and recidivism due to the lack of psychological resources creates a vicious cycle which leads to the community's taxes being raised to fund these institutions. However, the criminal justice system and its institutions aren't serving the common good properly due to the deficits in resources and mental health care. Why should you fund a system that doesn't serve its purpose and protect you? You may be asking yourself, well, how can I help, or what steps should be taken to solve this issue? There are many solutions, ranging from investigating other rectified criminal institutions and systems to making healthcare in our own communities easier to access. Take Norway, Finland, and Germany's reform prison system, for example. They simply have directed their focus on getting their inmates back into society instead of punishing them. They provide a humane facility and present them with the help they need to achieve their overall goal of getting back into society. If the United States criminal justice system would focus on the mental health crisis at hand, and getting their inmates back into society, mass incarceration would be reduced. The community wouldn't have to pay as much in taxes funding these institutions, and the general population would be safer. Furthermore, workshops could be required to teach prison guards and others how to work with inmates with mental illness. A nurse-led workshop by Semyon Milenkov and others proved that the interactions between prison officers and inmates can be improved, and psychoeducational interventions are a great tool for achieving that improvement. Surveys taken after a workshop showed an increased understanding of inmates with mental illness by correctional officers. In addition to these solutions, the limitations on mental health services within the community also drastically affect whether or not a person's mental illness goes untreated or not, which therefore determine whether they could end up in prison or not. According to Ritu Chatterjee, roughly 2/3 of Americans with a diagnosed mental health condition were unable to access treatment in 2021, though they had health insurance. This highlights the obstruction to individuals receiving mental help. Furthermore, funding cuts to programs like Medicaid and even smaller programs limit the community's access to mental health services, which, as we've seen, can make them more susceptible to ending up incarcerated. This highlights the need of funding to not only prisons and its institutions so that they can gather the resources they need, but also programs in the community that can serve as preventative resources. Although trusting mentally ill inmates when they come back into society can be challenging, if these individuals receive the psychological help they need, they will be significantly less likely to reoffend. I fear that if we don't recognize the mental health crisis in our communities and our criminal justice system, our general public will reap the effects of increasing crime rates, mass incarceration, and the lack of access to mental health services. There is a vast need for psychological help within correctional facilities, and we as a society have to advocate for mentally ill inmates before we see an increase of these effects.